The sky was silent. No radar lock, no missile tone, no warning, just vapor trails banking hard across the clouds. And then, out of nowhere, kill confirmed. It happened in less than 60 seconds. Somewhere over Nevada, during a red flag exercise, a veteran pilot, once trained in Soviet doctrine, now flying under NATO, found himself in the cockpit of an F-16 Fighting Falcon, staring down a simulated MiG-29 on his 6. He should have been outmatched. The MiG was faster in a straight line. It could climb like a rocket. On paper, it was one of the finest airframes Moscow had ever built, the pride of a generation. But paper didn't matter anymore. With one fluid motion, the F-16 pilot banked into a high G turn, pulling the nose just enough to center the MiG in his canopy. No warning for the adversary. No evasive maneuver. Just a silent cue from the radar, a quick flick on the targeting system. And then, tone. He squeezed the trigger. Fox 2. Kill. Back in the debriefing room, the pilot from the MiG simulation took off his helmet and muttered just one sentence. We never saw him coming. This wasn't an anomaly. It was becoming a pattern. In joint NATO exercises, mock dogfights, and real-world skirmishes, the F-16, originally dismissed by Soviet analysts as a lightweight toy, a budget jet, was racking up wins against more powerful adversaries. MiGs were built to dominate the vertical, but F-16s ruled the engagement. MiGs were trained to dogfight with brute force. F-16s danced, calculated, and struck before the fight even began. For decades, Soviet pilots had laughed at the idea that a single-engine American jet could match the hard-hitting, twin-engine ferocity of a MiG-29 or MiG-23. But as exercise after exercise unfolded, something became painfully clear. The F-16 wasn't playing by their rules. It wasn't about who turned tighter anymore. It was about who saw first, locked first, and killed first. And for the first time in their careers, MiG veterans were facing an enemy that could do all three, faster, smoother, and with terrifying silence. The legend of Soviet air dominance was cracking. And at the center of that fracture was a small, agile, underrated American jet with a bubble canopy and fly-by-wire wings. The jet that should have been prey had become the apex predator. The year was 1978, and deep inside a Soviet airbase near Lipetsk, a group of senior flight instructors gathered around classified NATO briefings. On the projection screen, grainy photos of a new American fighter, the F-16 Fighting Falcon. They studied its narrow fuselage, the single engine, the toy-like bubble canopy. A few scoffed. One colonel shook his head in disbelief. "It's not a real combat aircraft," he said. "That's an air show piece." And that belief, dismissive, confident, and deeply rooted, would echo across the entire Soviet aerospace establishment. To Soviet planners, the F-16 wasn't a threat. It was a mistake. The design seemed to violate everything Soviet doctrine stood for. It had only one engine, while MiGs like the 29 or 23 carried two for redundancy and thrust. It lacked heavy internal armor. Essential for surviving hard dogfights, it wasn't fast enough to match Mach 2+ interceptors, and its payload looked minimal compared to the hard-hitting Sukhois and MiGs of the Eastern Bloc. But what truly bothered them was philosophical. The Soviets believed in fighters with brute strength, aircraft that could climb high, turn hard, and strike fast. Air combat, in their minds, was a contest of G-force endurance, engine output, and raw muscle memory. They saw their own jets, MiG-21s, MiG-23s, and soon the MiG-29, as superior not only in hardware, but in purpose. Theirs were war machines, built for close-range slashes and rapid kills. And here came the F-16. Elegant, almost too smooth, as if NATO had designed it for balance, not brutality. So they filed it away as a lightweight multi-role fighter, useful for bombing villages in Third World Wars, maybe, but in the skies over Europe, against Warsaw Pact steel, it wouldn't last a minute. They were so convinced that for years, Soviet training barely included F-16 mock-ups. Pilots trained for F-4 Phantoms, F-15 Eagles, even older NATO strike craft. But the F-16? That was an afterthought. They didn't know what they were missing. What they dismissed as underpowered was in fact over-engineered for survival. What they mocked as weak was hyper-optimized for reaction speed. What they thought was cheap was actually deadly efficient. The wrong assumptions multiplied. Soviet radar crews believed the F-16 had low endurance. MiG tacticians assumed it would be an easy visual kill. Even intelligence officers in the GRU reported the jet as tactically inferior, strategically irrelevant. But underneath that sleek American airframe lived something entirely different. A digital fly-by-wire system that allowed it to dance around older jets. A cockpit that gave pilots panoramic awareness. A systems package that prioritized not force, but first look, first kill capability. And still, the laughter continued. Until the day the dogfights began. And the MiGs started to vanish from radar screens, one by one. The F-16 wasn't just surviving. It was dominating. And the room of wrong assumptions? It was about to get very, very quiet. To understand why Soviet planners misjudged the F-16 so catastrophically, we have to understand the doctrine that shaped the MiG, and the mindset of the men who flew them. Since the end of World War II, the Soviet Union had built its air combat philosophy around three pillars: speed, maneuverability, mass. Soviet fighters were designed not as surgical instruments, but as bludgeons. The MiG-15, MiG-17, and MiG-21 weren't built for elegance. They were built to flood the skies, overwhelm NATO air power through sheer numbers, and turn any dogfight into a knife fight. By the 1970s, the MiG-23 had introduced variable geometry wings and radar-guided missiles, giving Soviet fighters a longer reach. But the core doctrine hadn't changed. Close fast, hit hard, outnumber, outlast. It was a doctrine born of necessity. Soviet air bases were closer to the front. Their pilots trained in short bursts of high-G combat, not long-range engagements. Their radar systems were powerful, but rarely trusted. Instead, visual identification and proximity tactics ruled the day. The ultimate expression of this came with the MiG-29 Fulcrum. It was fast, Mach 225. It could turn inside an F-15. It had thrust vectoring, high angle of attack stability, and twin engines for brute power. To the Soviet military, this was the peak, the knife fighter built to kill Western jets at close range. But there was a problem. Actually, there were several. First, Soviet avionics were decades behind. Their radar lacked precision. Their cockpit displays were rudimentary. Situational awareness was low. Pilots relied on ground control intercepts, GCI, to vector them into fights. Without command guidance, they were often flying blind. Second, The doctrine assumed the West would engage in close combat. It assumed that American jets would try to dogfight, turn for turn, flare for flare. But American pilots weren't trained to outturn their enemy. They were trained to outthink them and kill before a turn even happened. Third, Soviet emphasis on quantity diluted quality. While MiGs poured out of production lines, pilot training lagged. Many Fulcrum pilots only had 100 to 200 hours before being declared combat ready. Their American counterparts? Closer to 500, 700 hours. Experience mattered, and the Soviets were burning through rookies. And yet the confidence in Soviet doctrine persisted. They believed the MiG-29 could tear apart the fragile F-16. They believed that their radar missile duels would even out in a draw. They believed that in close, their jets couldn't lose. But the battlefield was evolving. Dogfights were becoming rare. Kill chains were shortening. And awareness, not agility, was becoming the key to air superiority. In that world, the F-16 wasn't weak. It was perfectly engineered for the future. But the Soviets hadn't realized that yet. They still believed that in a sky full of MiGs, one F-16 would never stand a chance. They were about to be proven wrong. Not once, not twice, but again and again, until their doctrine broke. The first hints that something was wrong came not from NATO's top generals, but from Soviet-trained pilots themselves. It started quietly. Whispers from East German MiG-29 crews, subtle questions raised during Warsaw Pact exercises, then debriefings that didn't make sense on paper. An F-16 had been spotted on radar, briefly, before vanishing. A MiG-23 had been killed in a simulation without ever achieving visual contact. And when the post-exercise analysis came in, the pattern was impossible to ignore. The F-16 wasn't playing the Soviet game. It was rewriting the rules. NATO squadrons flying F-16s began racking up kill ratios that shocked even their instructors. In one simulated engagement during Red Flag, a four-ship F-16 formation eliminated 6 MiG-style opponents without a single loss. In another, a lone F-16 pilot in a defensive posture destroyed 3 attacking aircraft in under 2 minutes, using nothing but superior situational awareness and missile discipline. This wasn't what the MiG doctrine prepared for, and the reason boiled down to something Soviet engineers had never prioritized: pilot synergy with the machine. In the F-16, the pilot didn't just fly, he commanded. The bubble canopy gave him unmatched 360-degree visibility. The side-stick controller, designed for high-G comfort, let him maneuver intuitively. The fly-by-wire system ensured the aircraft could push the limits of physics without stalling. More importantly, the cockpit told the pilot everything: radar contacts, missile readiness, angle of attack limits, fuel reserves, all laid out in a simple, color-coded HUD. There was no cockpit clutter, no analog chaos, no guesswork. Meanwhile, in the MiG-29 or MiG-23, pilots had to juggle outdated radar scopes, button-heavy panels, and ground control instructions, often delivered with delays or partial data. One ex-East German pilot, after defecting, described the moment it clicked. In the MiG, you fly the plane and pray. In the F-16, you feel like the plane is flying with you. That difference, psychological, ergonomic, lethal, became clear in every dogfight. The F-16 didn't need to outturn a MiG. It just needed to see first, shoot first, and get out alive. And it did, again and again. Israeli F-16s downed Syrian MiG-21s and MiG-23s with near-embarrassing ease in the Bekaa Valley in 1982, often without being seen. U.S. pilots in NATO exercises pulled kills before MiGs ever got a radar lock. And air forces from Belgium to Singapore began rewriting their air combat manuals around the Falcon's real-world results. Yet in Soviet HQs, many still clung to denial. They claimed the exercises were rigged, that the kill ratios were exaggerated, that American pilots were just luckier or had better terrain. But the truth was already airborne. The F-16 wasn't just good, it was the most agile, most intuitive, most pilot-friendly air superiority platform in NATO. And every time a MiG-29 squared up for a dogfight, it lost. When the first reports came in, of F-16s outgunning MiG-23s, outmaneuvering MiG-21s, and even surviving engagements with MiG-29s, Soviet tacticians fell back on the same defense. It's not the jet, it's the pilot. They told themselves that NATO wins came from superior training, that MiG pilots had made avoidable mistakes, that in a real dogfight, with equally trained opponents, maneuverability would always decide the outcome. It was a comforting lie, but a lie nonetheless. Because the F-16 had changed the very definition of maneuverability. Traditionally, Soviet engineers measured agility with instantaneous turn rate, climb rate, and thrust-to-weight ratios, all areas where the MiG-29, on paper, had advantages. In close, sustained turning fights, it could theoretically hold angles better than an F-16. That's what the math said. But in real air combat, the math doesn't fly the jet. Dogfights aren't fought on chalkboards. They're fought in cockpits at 9Gs, where seconds are survival, and every missed cue is a coffin nail. And in that space, the F-16 was merciless. Here's why. 1. Fly-by-wire superiority. The MiG-29's aerodynamic design was excellent, but it relied on the pilot to manually manage every aspect of flight. The F-16? It used a digital fly-by-wire system that calculated and adjusted flight surfaces hundreds of times per second. That meant tighter turns without departure, instant corrections, and a margin of safety MiG pilots simply didn't have. 2. Energy management. MiG pilots often bled speed during tight turns, exposing them to follow-up attacks. F-16 pilots, thanks to their computer-assisted handling, could hold energy longer and re-engage quicker. They didn't just escape. They counterattacked. 3. Situational awareness. In a merge, F-16 pilots had a panoramic view from the bubble canopy. MiG pilots? Cramped cockpits with limited rear visibility, a fatal flaw in any tail chase. 4. Weapons integration. The Falcon's HUD, radar, and missile systems were integrated into a seamless kill chain. A single glance could confirm lock, range, and target speed. MiG pilots had to track radar cues, switch weapon modes, and manually cue their weapons, sometimes while pulling 7 to 8 Gs. All of this meant one thing. The F-16 didn't need to win in a turning battle. It just needed to position once and fire first. But Soviet theorists kept clinging to the myth. They doubled down on turning duels. They simulated perfect merges. They believed that if they could just get close enough, the MiG would always win. They were wrong. In combat, closeness meant death. The F-16 made sure of it. In one red flag scenario, 2 F-16s lured a group of MiG-29s into a turning engagement, then executed a bracket maneuver using real-time comms and radar cues. Within 30 seconds, the MiGs were dead before completing their first brake turn. Maneuver hadn't saved them. It had led them straight into a trap. And for Soviet doctrine, still dreaming of Top Gun-style knife fights, that was a humiliation too bitter to admit. Faced with mounting evidence of the F-16's superiority, Soviet planners retreated into their most familiar comfort: overwhelming numbers. They reasoned that even if the F-16 was more efficient, even if it had better sensors, superior avionics, and more intuitive controls, none of that would matter in the face of a sky filled with MiGs. Quantity has a quality all its own, they often said, and for decades it had worked. From the early Cold War onward, Soviet industry churned out thousands of fighters. The MiG-21 alone saw production numbers exceed 11,000 units, more than any modern jet in history. The logic was simple. For every NATO pilot in an F-16, there would be 5 MiGs waiting. Mass would win. Swarm tactics would overwhelm, and attrition would bleed the West dry. But there was a problem. Actually, several. First, modern air combat isn't a numbers game. It's a systems game. And the F-16 wasn't flying alone. Every Fighting Falcon was connected, via data link, via AWACS, via ground command. It was part of a network, receiving real-time updates, target vectors, and engagement priority. MiG pilots still relied on voice commands and radar snapshots. F-16s had a shared brain. Second, red air wasn't cheap anymore. The MiG-29, MiG-31, and Su-27 weren't bargain jets. They required significant maintenance, costly engines, and complex logistics. And they lacked the modularity that made the F-16 such a scalable platform. You could upgrade an F-16 across decades. MiGs? You replaced them. Third, the kill ratio spoke for itself. In almost every real-world engagement, from Middle Eastern skies to NATO exercises, one F-16 consistently walked away from fights with multiple kills. Whether against MiG-21s, 23s, or even 29s, the Falcon didn't just survive. It multiplied force. In one training scenario, a 4-ship F-16 squadron eliminated over a dozen MiG-23 aggressors in a rolling dogfight, using coordinated missile launches, radar locks from standoff range, and aggressive bracket tactics. The MiGs, trying to swarm, flew directly into a kill funnel. One AWACS officer watching the exercise remarked, "It was like watching wolves walk into a minefield." More tellingly, the cost efficiency was brutally lopsided. Each F-16 sortie delivered more effect, more survivability, and more tactical success than any equivalent MiG package. And when it came time to refuel, rearm, and relaunch, the F-16s were back in the sky faster. But the biggest blow came in 1989, when NATO simulations revealed that in the event of a Warsaw Pact offensive, MiG squadrons would suffer unsustainable losses within 72 hours, largely due to precision strikes, electronic warfare, and F-16-led air interdiction. Soviet doctrine had no answer. No amount of MiGs could compensate for smarter jets. No swarm could outthink linked targeting data. No wave of red air could overcome a fighter that killed first, escaped second, and returned third. The red air playbook was collapsing. And the West didn't even need to rewrite it. They just flew past it, in 9G turns and laser-straight missile shots. The truth was now undeniable. The F-16 wasn't just better. It was built to outlive the Soviet numbers game. Throughout the 1980s, Soviet military intelligence was convinced it had the measure of every NATO asset, including the F-16. Its speed was known. Its payloads catalogued. its radar range estimated, its engine thrust charted. And yet, when the F-16 began wiping the floor with MiG squadrons in training simulations in Middle Eastern skies and along NATO's front lines, Soviet analysts scrambled for answers. The data didn't match their assumptions. It wasn't a miscalculation. It was a total failure of imagination. GRU officers had assumed the F-16 was a light strike platform, a cheaper supplement to the F-15 Eagle. Western press clippings had played right into this narrative, touting its affordability, exportability, and single-engine simplicity. To Soviet eyes, the Falcon looked like a discount dogfighter. They missed the point entirely. They didn't see that the F-16 was never designed to dominate alone. It was a platform, modular, adaptable, and born for system integration. What the Soviets didn't understand, or refused to believe, was how tightly NATO's doctrine had woven the F-16 into sensor networks, command control systems, and multinational strike packages. To them, a fighter jet was a lone wolf. To the West, the F-16 was a node in a digital pack. The Soviet underestimation ran deep. Field agents failed to report just how intuitive the Falcon's cockpit systems had become. Radar lock-on times were faster than estimated. Pilot workload was dramatically lower, and real-time data sharing meant no F-16 ever flew blind. Even worse, Soviet test pilots assigned to fly against captured or simulated F-16 tactics weren't allowed to speak publicly about the results. Those who defected, like East German and Polish pilots, brought back stories of shock. F-16 tracking multiple targets while jamming incoming radar, pilots reacting to threats before radar pings arrived. Missiles fired from F-16s connecting at angles MiG pilots thought were physically impossible. One Polish defector said it bluntly. "We didn't know we were outgunned until it was over. They saw us. We didn't see them. And then we were dead." Even within the Soviet Air Force, cracks began to appear. Internal memos from 1987 warned that the F-16's versatility made it unsurvivable to confront in isolation. But by then, the production lines were locked in. The MiG-29 was too far along. The doctrine too entrenched. Intelligence failures piled up. Failure to appreciate the true range and speed of AIM-120 missiles when cued by AWACS. Failure to recognize the Falcon's sustained turn advantage due to digital flight control. Failure to anticipate the rise of helmet-mounted cueing systems, giving F-16 pilots missile lock just by looking at the target, and perhaps, worst of all, the Soviets believed they had time. Time to match. Time to adapt. Time to counter. They were wrong. By the time Soviet generals realized what the F-16 truly was, not just a fighter, but a battlefield information system with wings, it had already done its damage. Their pilots were losing simulations. Their war games were unraveling. Their MiGs were falling, and no one understood why. Because the one thing Soviet intelligence couldn't steal was a doctrine they never imagined. To the untrained eye, the F-16 looked simple. A single engine, a narrow frame, no variable geometry, no thrust vectoring, no twin tail. But that simplicity masked the true genius of its design. It wasn't built to win the war alone. It was built to win with the system. Unlike Soviet fighters, which were often optimized to perform individually in high-speed, close-quarters combat, the F-16 was integrated from day one into a broader Western combat network. Its advantage wasn't just in agility or speed, though it had both. Its real weapon was information. 1. Sensor fusion in the sky. At the heart of the F-16's air dominance was its radar system, the AN/APG-66 and later upgrades. It wasn't just powerful, it was efficient. Able to track multiple targets, quickly discriminate between threats, prioritize engagements with minimal pilot input. This meant that while a MiG pilot was still wrestling with analog scopes and voice commands, the F-16 pilot had a dynamic, living picture of the sky on his heads-up display. 2. Link 16 and beyond. The F-16 was among the first tactical fighters to fully exploit Link 16, a secure, jam-resistant data link that allowed real-time sharing of target information between jets, AWACS, ground stations, and naval assets. With this system, a single F-16 didn't need to see its target. It could receive targeting data from an aircraft hundreds of miles away. The shooter didn't need to be the spotter. A revolutionary shift. 3. Joint Engagement Doctrine. NATO doctrine revolved around combined arms, joint targeting, and force multiplication. An F-16 package didn't fly alone. It flew with electronic warfare support. It flew with air refueling, with SEAD units, with drone scouts, even in exercises. It was part of a choreography the Soviets couldn't match. While MiGs surged in aggressive clusters, F-16s coordinated with AWACS, tracked SAM threats in real time, and struck with precision from well outside visual range. 4. Pilot-centric design philosophy. Inside the F-16 cockpit, the world changed. The bubble canopy gave total awareness. The side stick reduced fatigue under high Gs. The HUD laid out all vital info, weapons, radar locks, threat alerts, in clean, intuitive displays. Flight control computers prevented stalls, allowing pilots to push the airframe to its max without risking blackout-inducing spinouts. The result? F-16 pilots thought faster, saw farther, and survived longer. In a world where seconds mattered, the Falcon bought its pilots minutes. 5. The multi-role reality. While Soviet aircraft were often split between interceptors and strike roles, the F-16 was a true multi-role monster. Air-to-air with AIM-9, Sidewinders or AM-120, AMRAAMs, air-to-ground with laser-guided bombs, Sea-Aid with AGM-88 HARMs, reconnaissance with podded sensors. And all of this flown from a single jet that cost half as much as a MiG-29 to maintain and modernize. That modularity paid off. F-16s remained in production for decades, serving in more than 25 air forces, constantly upgraded, constantly evolving. From the F-16A to the Block 70+ Viper variants, radar, weapons, and defensive systems kept pace with fifth-gen threats. MiG platforms couldn't keep up. Even the MiG-35, decades later, was struggling to integrate the kind of sensor fusion and BVR capabilities that the F-16 had mastered in the 1990s. The F-16 wasn't just a jet. It was a combat node in a smarter, faster, deadlier machine. And in every engagement, whether against MiGs, SAMs, or insurgent threats, the Falcon didn't just fly. It dominated through doctrine, a doctrine built not on brute force, but on brains, bandwidth, and balance. The Soviets were flying war horses. But the West? They were flying with the future. The myth of Soviet air superiority didn't die in one battle. It bled out, slowly, humiliatingly, across dozens of exercises, encounters, and engagements where MiG pilots realized, often too late, that their jets were no longer the hunters. They were the targets. In red flag simulations over the Nevada desert, MiG-style aggressor squadrons flew high-performance jets built to mimic Soviet tactics. Fast approaches, hard turns, overwhelming numbers. F-16s flew against them repeatedly, and repeatedly they won. One NATO pilot recalled an engagement where a MiG-29 dove in from altitude, expecting a close-in merge. Instead, the F-16 team split formation, used radar triangulation, and bracketed the MiG before it could react. It was dead in under 30 seconds. In another exercise, an F-16 pilot maneuvered his jet into a high-G spiral dive, not to escape, but to bait the MiG-21 behind him into bleeding energy. The MiG followed, committed to the turn. What it didn't see was the second Falcon, flanking below, locking on, and scoring a clean, simulated kill. These weren't flukes. They were systematic failures of Soviet air design. Failure 1. Poor situational awareness. The MiG-29 cockpit was a jungle of dials, switches, and legacy controls. Rear visibility was poor. Radar resolution was limited. Pilots often had no idea who was behind them. The F-16's canopy gave nearly 360 degrees vision. Its radar and data link painted the sky like a living map. 2. Inferior avionics integration. Firing a missile in a MiG was a process. Switch modes, confirm radar lock, estimate closure speed. In the F-16, one glance, one tone, one shot. That speed of execution saved lives and ended fights before they began. Failure 3. Training gap NATO. F-16 pilots often had 500-700 flight hours before combat certification. MiG pilots, sometimes as few as 200. One Israeli pilot flying an F-16 against Syrian MiGs in 1992 reported, "They came in fast, turned tight, and missed everything. By the time they turned again, we were already behind them." In the Bekaa Valley, Israeli F-16s and F-15s engaged Syrian MiG-21s and MiG-23s in a legendary air campaign. The kill ratio? Over 80.0. Not a single Western jet lost. In the 1990s, post-Cold War German pilots trained with both MiG-29s, inherited from East Germany, and F-16s. Their verdict? The MiG-29 can turn. The F-16 can win. Even in smaller air forces, like Pakistan's, the story repeated. In joint drills, F-16s consistently outperformed Indian MiG-21s and MiG-29s, relying on better radar fusion, smarter missile tactics, and cleaner cockpit workflows. The MiG wasn't a bad jet. It just wasn't enough anymore. The moment close-range dogfighting gave way to networked aerial warfare, the MiG was out of its element. Its advantages in thrust and turn radius meant little when it couldn't see the fight until it was over. And F-16s? They saw everything. They didn't chase kills. They stacked them. From beyond visual range to knife-edge merges, the Falcon had redefined what it meant to win in the air. The MiGs, once feared, were now being used as training targets. And every time a new pilot strapped into a Falcon, one truth became clearer. In the Cold War skies, the jet that turned tighter wasn't the winner. The jet that thought faster was. The breaking point didn't come in combat. It came during a training exercise that was never meant to be public. In 1988, a multinational NATO force convened in the Mediterranean for exercise display determination, a large-scale simulation involving U.S. Air Force F-16s, West German Phantoms, British Tornadoes, and a contingent of MiG-29s secretly provided by a newly cooperative East German command. The goal? Test East versus West in the closest thing to real combat ever attempted without shooting live rounds. On day 1, Soviet-aligned MiG-29 pilots entered the exercise brimming with confidence. They had the power, the thrust, the turning rate. They expected to dominate the sky. They were wrong. The F-16s flew in formations of 4, supported by E-3 AWACS. From the moment they took off, they were in constant communication, using Link 16 data feeds to track enemy movements and coordinate firing solutions. The MiGs? They flew in pairs. They relied on radar snapshots and voice commands. Their situational awareness was 3 steps behind. Within the first hour, 8 MiG-29s were shot down without ever getting within missile range. Some were flanked. Others lured into kill funnels. All were taken out before even realizing they were under threat. One NATO observer described the result as a controlled demolition of everything Soviet air doctrine stood for. And that was just the start. By day 3, the MiG pilots were demoralized. Their tactics, head-on charges, brute force climbs, tight brake turns, were being countered with mathematical precision. Every dive was anticipated. Every turn punished. Every radar lock broken by countermeasures and angles they'd never trained against. Then came the mock mass engagement. A 12 versus 12 battle. MiGs on one side, F-16s and Allied jets on the other. It was supposed to be a fair fight. It lasted under 9 minutes. The final tally? 11 MiGs downed, 1 F-16 lightly damaged and returned to base. The East German commander overseeing the MiG unit asked for a full debrief. When presented with the kill logs, radar playback, and maneuver data, he reportedly said, "Our jets flew like ghosts, but the F-16s flew like gods." That quote never made it into official Soviet records. But what did make it was a sudden acceleration in MiG-29 modernization programs, followed by internal memos urging the development of better cockpit avionics and longer-range BVR capabilities. It was too late. The F-16 had proven its superiority not just in war, but in the kind of training scenarios that mimicked the next war. No blood was shed. No missiles were fired. But Soviet air doctrine had just suffered its most public, humiliating defeat. A jet they once called fragile had shattered the illusion of invincibility. And the MiGs, once feared symbols of Soviet power, had become cautionary tales, fast, deadly, but outdated the moment the fight went digital. For decades, the Soviet Union built its air doctrine around an ironclad belief. Superior performance in numbers would always defeat Western complexity. Their jets were simpler, cheaper, faster to produce. Their pilots were hardened by repetition and survival. Their MiGs were good enough. The F-16 proved otherwise. In the wake of exercises like Display Determination and Red Flag, and with increasing debriefs from defector pilots, Soviet generals were forced to confront an unthinkable truth. Their entire air superiority doctrine had been built on the wrong foundation. What they once viewed as unnecessary, battlefield networking, digital integration, pilot-centric control systems, had become the deciding factor in modern air combat. The West had been preparing for a war the Soviets didn't believe in. A war fought at information speed, not engine speed. A war decided by sensor range, not turn radius. A war where the first shot wasn't just a kill, it was the only shot. The MiG was supposed to be a hero of socialism. Fast, mass-produced, designed for the collective. But in head-to-head tests, it failed, not because it was slow, but because it was blind. F-16s could engage from beyond visual range. They could fly farther with fewer failures. They could be upgraded across decades without losing effectiveness. And critically, they could survive. Not through armor, but through awareness. Soviet engineers scrambled for solutions. New variants of the MiG-29 were drafted. The MiG-31 interceptor was rushed into relevance. Advanced Su-27 platforms began field testing, but the damage was done. The Warsaw Pact had banked its entire air strategy on a doctrine now exposed as brittle. Every victory by an F-16 sent shockwaves through Soviet planning bureaus, each one chipping away at a military mythology that had once seemed unshakable. One internal Soviet report from 1989 summed up the dilemma. The Western fighter is not better in power, it is better in mind. That single sentence, a quiet admission in a closed-circle meeting, was the death knell for the Soviet belief in air dominance through muscle alone. The F-16, built not to intimidate, but to integrate, had exposed a fatal weakness in the Soviet system. They'd been preparing for yesterday's war, and the West had already moved on. By the time the Cold War ended in 1991, many MiG squadrons were obsolete, outclassed not just by better jets, but by a better system. And the F-16? It was still flying. Still evolving. Still winning. Soviet air doctrine had collapsed, not in flames, but in silence, not from combat losses, but from a deeper, more painful truth. They were no longer fighting the future. They were fighting ghosts. Decades have passed since the Cold War's final maneuvers. The Soviet Union is gone. The Warsaw Pact dissolved. But the fighter that broke their myth? Still flying. The F-16 Fighting Falcon, once dismissed as a lightweight throwaway, now holds the title of the most widely used fourth-generation fighter in the world. Over 4,600 units produced, flown by more than 25 countries, combat tested in every major conflict since the 1980s. And it's not slowing down. Modernized F-16 variants, like the Block 70-72 Viper, now carry AESA radars, electronic warfare suites, helmet-mounted cueing, and precision-guided everything. They can link with F-35s, drones, and satellites in real time. They are not relics. They are still lethal. Meanwhile, many MiG models that once terrified NATO planners sit in scrapyards or fly in ceremonial parades. The MiG-21, outdated. The MiG-23, retired. The MiG-29, maintained by a dwindling number of air forces, often without full system support. The pilots who once laughed at the F-16 now train their cadets to fear it, to respect it, to never underestimate a jet just because it's quiet, clean, and small. Because that was the fatal Cold War mistake, and it cost them an entire generation of air doctrine. In museums across the world, MiGs and F-16s sometimes sit side by side. To the casual eye, they look like equals, Cold War siblings from opposite sides, but only one of them still rules the sky. Only one of them still flies in active service, enforcing no-fly zones, leading strike packages, defending sovereign airspace. Only one of them became the benchmark. And every time it takes off, every time it locks onto a target before being seen, every time it returns home without a scratch, it carries with it the ghost of the Cold War, a silent reminder that power doesn't always roar. Sometimes it flies in with a whisper and leaves behind a revolution. The MiG was supposed to break the West. The F-16 broke the MiG.